Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing that every dollar you've ever earned, saved, or spent was never really money in the way you thought. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't value. It wasn't something created because America produced more, sold more, or innovated more. It was debt. Someone else's debt. A digital illusion carefully wrapped in confidence, routine, and trust. That's the truth most Americans never hear, because if they did, everything they believe about the economy would start to crack. The dollar isn't just a currency, it's a system built on a paradox so deep that once you see it, you can't unsee it. Trillions of dollars appear inside the financial system every year, not because someone mined gold or produced goods, but because someone typed numbers on a screen. No physical backing, no limitation, no real production tied to it, just creation, instant, effortless, infinite. But here's the twist. Every one of those dollars is stamped as debt, created from nothing, yet owed forever. How can something be owed when it didn't exist until a moment ago? How can a nation be indebted for money that appeared with a keystroke? This is the contradiction at the heart of the American economy, and it leads to questions most people never dare to ask. If the money we use is debt, then who is the lender? Who controls the supply? Who benefits from the system? And why does the U.S. national debt never shrink, only grow? To understand that, you need to look at the institution that sits quietly behind every dollar, the Federal Reserve. Most Americans believe it's a government agency, like the Treasury or the IRS. The truth is far stranger. The Federal Reserve looks government-run on the surface. Official buildings, official language, official authority. But beneath the image, its foundation rests on private ownership. 12 regional Federal Reserve banks form its backbone, and each one operates as a private corporation with commercial banks as shareholders. These banks, private institutions, hold stock in the branches of the very system that creates U.S. currency. Think about that for a moment. The entity responsible for controlling interest rates, guiding economic cycles, and literally creating the dollar is structured as a hybrid of public power and private influence, a piece of the government and a piece of the banking industry merged into one. Most Americans have no idea this setup exists, yet it shapes their mortgages, their rents, their savings accounts, their grocery bills, their investments, everything. And this hybrid structure leads to a truth almost nobody talks about. The people who profit from the system also help run the system. To understand the weight of that, you need to understand how the dollar is actually born. Not metaphorically, not theoretically, but mechanically. Here's how it really works. Whenever Congress wants to spend more money than taxes bring in, and that's nearly every year, the Treasury issues bonds. These are IOUs promising repayment in the future. Investors buy some, but the Federal Reserve steps in to buy the rest when needed. And when the Fed buys those bonds, it doesn't use money pulled from reserves or revenue or investment returns. It simply creates new dollars on the spot, with a keystroke, from nothing. Those newly created dollars enter the economy instantly, but they don't enter as neutral currency. They enter as liabilities, because the government now owes repayment on the bonds the Fed purchased, repayment in dollars plus interest. So the money supply grows, and at the exact same time, the national debt grows. They rise together, like twins, because in this system, one cannot exist without the other. And that's just the beginning of the loop. Most Americans don't know this next part. The regional Federal Reserve banks have boards of directors, and the majority of those directors are elected by member banks, private commercial banks. Those directors then select the presidents of each regional Fed bank, and those presidents help form the committee that shapes national monetary policy. So follow the chain. Banks benefit from credit creation. Banks elect the people who help run the Fed. The Fed sets policies that affect credit creation. And the cycle continues. It is a self-reinforcing loop, one where influence feeds power and power feeds profit. But the real genius of the system lies in the interest engine at its core. When the Federal Reserve buys government bonds with money it created from nothing, those bonds begin paying interest. That interest doesn't come from Wall Street. It doesn't come from investors. It doesn't come from some abstract pool of corporate profits. It comes from taxpayers every year. And private banks receive guaranteed dividends from the system as well, written directly into law. Whether the economy is booming or collapsing, member banks earn a fixed return simply because they are part of the structure. So think about that. Money is created at zero cost. The government owes interest on it. Taxpayers fund the interest. Banks receive dividends. And the machine keeps turning. This structure leads to a revelation most Americans never hear. The national debt cannot reach zero. In fact, the system depends on it never reaching zero, because every dollar that exists originated from a debt instrument. If you remove the debt, you would remove the dollars themselves. Paying everything off would collapse the currency. It would be like shutting down the engine while driving at full speed. That's why the national debt grows year after year, administration after administration, regardless of political party. It's not mismanagement, it's structural necessity. And the mathematical design behind it makes escape impossible. Here's the part that feels like a trick, but it isn't. When a loan is issued, whether it's a treasury bond, a mortgage, or a corporate loan, the principal enters the economy, but the interest does not. There is no mechanism that injects interest money into the system at the moment of creation. So collectively, system-wide, the amount of money owed is always greater than the amount of money that exists. Someone must default, someone must fall behind, or the government must issue new debt to create more money to pay the interest on old debt. This means the total debt must grow forever. If it stops growing, the system suffocates. It's not a flaw, it's the blueprint. And this blueprint has shaped every recession, every boom, every crisis, and every recovery in modern American history. But here's the part that adds pressure to the entire narrative. Every time a president tried to challenge this architecture, every time a leader attempted to shift money creation back to the government, the backlash was immediate and severe. Political warfare, economic sabotage, and in some historical cases, outcomes far darker. We'll get to that. But first, understand this. The structure is not accidental. It is the foundation of American power, and the reason why control over money creation surpasses political authority. Because the people who create the money write the rules, and the people who write the rules don't need elections. The deeper you travel into America's monetary architecture, the clearer it becomes that this system wasn't built for transparency. It was built for durability, for endurance, for control. And throughout history, whenever someone with power tried to redirect the flow away from private influence and back toward the government, the system pushed back with unimaginable force. This is why the story of American money isn't just about economics. It's about struggle. It's about presidents who realize that the authority to create a nation's currency is the authority to shape its destiny. And for a brief moment, some of them tried to reclaim that authority. Take Andrew Jackson, a figure both celebrated and condemned in American history. But on one point, he was unwavering. He saw centralized private control over the nation's money as a threat far greater than foreign armies. Jackson dismantled the Second Bank of the United States, a predecessor to today's Federal Reserve. He believed no private institution should hold that level of power over the public. And when he succeeded, he declared it his greatest victory. But that victory did not last. Decades later, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln faced a crisis unlike anything the country had ever seen. With the nation splitting in two and war costs exploding, Lincoln made a radical decision. He issued government-backed currency known as greenbacks, money created directly by the government, free from private debt. No interest owed, no external lender. It worked. It stabilized the Union's finances during one of the most chaotic periods in American history. But after the war, the system reverted. The greenbacks faded. The power shifted back to the institutions that would eventually shape the Federal Reserve. And then there was John F. Kennedy. In 1963, he signed Executive Order 11110, expanding the Treasury's authority to issue currency backed by silver, an attempt, some argue, to nudge the system away from Federal Reserve dependence. Whether that was his intention or not, the order challenged the structure of money creation. Months later, Kennedy was assassinated. Now, history is complicated. Cause and effect are rarely simple. But when you look at the pattern, a theme emerges. Leaders who tried to redirect monetary power away from private institutions faced consequences, political, economic, or personal. Whether those consequences were designed, coincidental, or systemic backlash, the message was clear. The architecture of American money was not meant to be rewritten. This brings us to the question that has gone viral in every corner of social media. Does the Federal Reserve owe the money it creates to anyone? If it prints trillions, who does it pay back? The answer is simple and devastating. The Federal Reserve does not owe the money to anyone because it creates the money. It doesn't borrow the dollars it issues, it doesn't earn them, it doesn't mine them, it produces them. But the government owes the Fed for every dollar issued. The moment money is created through bond purchases, the government becomes indebted, and the public becomes responsible for servicing that debt through taxation. That's the part that people rarely understand. You don't owe the national debt, but the system makes sure you fund it every paycheck, every tax cycle, every year. And when the money supply expands through more borrowing, your contribution increases, not through a bill labeled debt repayment, but through inflation, diminished purchasing power, and rising costs that quietly transfer value upward. This is why, even though the Federal Reserve returns most of its profits to the Treasury, the underlying structure still funnels wealth upward. Private banks receive guaranteed dividends, corporations borrow at favorable rates. Financial institutions benefit from asset inflation, and the public absorbs the long-term costs. But that's only part of the story. The real revelation begins when you see how this architecture shapes everything else: politics, markets, national strength, global influence. Because the institution that controls the creation of money doesn't just influence the economy, it influences policy. It influences governments. It influences empires. Think about it. If a political leader proposes a bold new policy, universal health care, military expansion, tax cuts, infrastructure, anything, the question always becomes, how will we pay for it? But the government doesn't create the money. The Federal Reserve does, and it creates that money through mechanisms that keep the government in perpetual debt. So political power bends itself around monetary power. That's why when you strip away the illusions, you begin to see the hierarchy clearly. Congress debates spending, presidents sign budgets, Voters argue over taxes. But the engine driving the entire system, the authority that governs the flow of currency, sits behind closed doors, beyond ballots, beyond public influence. This creates a dynamic where elected officials come and go, but the monetary system remains untouched. Administrations rise and fall, but the debt climbs. Parties fight, but the money machine continues running exactly as designed, and with every cycle, the gap between those who understand the system and those who live inside it grows wider. Now imagine an average American hearing for the first time that the dollars in their wallet originated as government debt, that the money supply depends on perpetual borrowing, that paying off the national debt would collapse the currency, that inflation is not a mistake, but a necessary feature of the model, that the real power in the economic system lies not in voting booths, but in boardrooms they've never seen. It feels unreal. It feels engineered. It feels like something too big to be accidental. But once you understand the mechanics, it becomes obvious. The Federal Reserve does not control the government, but it controls the environment in which the government operates, and the environment determines the outcome. Control the money, and you control the options. Control the options, and you control the nation. And this power extends far beyond U.S. borders. Because the American dollar is the global reserve currency, the architecture of the Fed doesn't just shape the U.S. economy, it shapes the world. Countries borrow in dollars, trade in dollars, hold reserves in dollars. The decisions made inside Federal Reserve boardrooms ripple across continents. A small interest rate adjustment can shake entire nations. A shift in quantitative policy can collapse foreign currencies. A liquidity injection can determine which global markets live or die. That's the scale of influence we're dealing with. Not simply domestic financial management, but global power projection through monetary policy. And yet, inside America, the majority of the population still believes money is something simple, something physical, something earned, something printed by the government like a receipt. They don't see the deeper layers, the debt beneath the currency, the private structure beneath the institution, the mathematical trap beneath the national debt, the quiet wealth transfer beneath inflation. They only feel the symptoms: rising prices, shrinking savings, higher interest rates, stagnant wages, disappearing retirement security. Symptoms of a system designed to expand in one direction, upward. And this leads us to the inevitable question: who then holds the true power in America? If the government must borrow the money it spends, if the public must pay interest on the dollars in circulation, if the institutions that benefit from the system also help run the system, if debt must grow forever, if inflation quietly erodes purchasing power every year, then who sits at the top? The answer isn't a politician, it isn't a party, it isn't a president, it's the institutions that control money creation. The private financial networks embedded within the structure of the Federal Reserve, the system that dictates the cost of credit, the availability of liquidity, the direction of markets, and the value of the dollar itself. They don't need to run for office. They don't need approval ratings. They don't need public support. Because their power doesn't flow from votes, it flows from the ability to shape the money that shapes the nation. And once you understand that, the rest of the story begins to make sense. Once you see the machinery behind the dollar, you start to understand something deeper, something unsettling, something that changes the way you interpret every headline, every financial crisis, every political speech. Because behind the noise, behind the debates, behind the public narratives, the system marches forward with a kind of mechanical certainty. And the more you study it, the more you realize it isn't just an economic model, it's a hierarchy, a power structure, one that quietly governs the largest economy on Earth. But to truly grasp the scale of its influence, you have to return to the beginning. To the very first question: why does money exist as debt? Why not create currency the way most people imagine, printed by the government, spent into the economy, debt-free, interest-free? Why attach every dollar to a liability? The answer reveals a truth about modern finance. Money is not just a medium of exchange, it's a control mechanism. Every dollar must return to its issuer. Every dollar has a claim on it. Every dollar binds the government to the institutions that purchased its bonds and the institutions that create its liquidity. This design creates a perpetual cycle that ensures dependence: government dependence on borrowing, public dependence on wages, corporate dependence on credit, and global dependence on the US dollar. Think about how this plays out in everyday life. A business wants to expand, so it borrows. A family wants a home, so it borrows. A student wants an education, so they borrow. A government launches a program, so it borrows. Borrowing becomes the oxygen of the modern economy. Not because everyone loves debt, but because the system forces it. And the Federal Reserve becomes the gatekeeper of that oxygen. Raise interest rates, and suddenly the cost of breathing goes up. Lower them, and the economy surges. Flood markets with liquidity, and risk becomes cheap. Pull liquidity back, and markets collapse. This is why every financial crisis, from the Great Depression to the 2008 meltdown to the volatility of recent years, eventually lands in the hands of the Federal Reserve. Not because the Fed caused every crisis, but because it is the only institution with the authority to reshape the money supply at scale. And when the Fed acts, the world reacts. Remember 2008, when the housing market imploded, banks seized, and credit froze? The system was on the brink of collapse, not because there wasn't enough wealth, but because there wasn't enough liquidity. There weren't enough dollars to service the debt that already existed. The trap had tightened. And to break it, the Federal Reserve created trillions instantly, just like the keystrokes that create money from nothing today. Not backed by gold, not backed by production, backed only by the confidence that the system still held together. The public was told it was a bailout, a rescue, a necessary intervention. But beneath the narrative, the pattern repeated. The wealth transfer continued upward, asset prices recovered, financial institutions stabilized, and ordinary Americans carried the weight of the aftermath for years. This wasn't a glitch. It was the system protecting itself. And when the 2020 pandemic hit, the cycle repeated again, with even larger numbers, even faster money creation, and even deeper reliance on the machine at the center of it all. Trillions appeared, debts surged, and the inflation that followed didn't come from nowhere. It was the consequence of expanding the money supply in a system where every dollar already carried an obligation. But inflation has a purpose. It is not only an economic phenomenon, it is a political tool. It slowly reduces the value of every dollar you earn, while the government's debt becomes easier to repay in cheaper currency. It shifts wealth away from savers and toward asset holders. It rewards those closest to money creation and punishes those furthest from it. This is why the people who understand the system don't store their wealth in dollars. They store it in assets, stocks, real estate, commodities, businesses, anything that rises as the value of the currency falls. And those who don't understand the system stay trapped in the cycle, earning money that loses value, paying rising prices, borrowing at rates they can't control. The divide grows wider, not because the rich work harder, but because they sit closer to the source. This brings us back to the core question: who actually sits at the source? Most people imagine a room filled with economists and policymakers, charts on the walls, data on screens, calm discussions about interest rates and inflation. But the real power lies not in personalities. It lies in the structure. A structure where private banks elect key figures within the Federal Reserve System, where financial institutions influence regulatory frameworks, where monetary policy determines the fate of markets long before voters ever hear about it on the news. This is why presidents come and go, but the trajectory of the economy rarely changes. The money machine keeps running because it isn't driven by elections. It's driven by the architecture of debt-based currency. And when presidents do try to challenge that architecture, Jackson, Lincoln, Kennedy, the resistance is immediate, because money creation is the foundation of national sovereignty. And once that foundation is handed to a hybrid of public authority and private power, reclaiming it becomes almost impossible. But perhaps the most revealing part of this entire story is how ordinary Americans are kept from seeing the structure at all. Not through secrecy, but through complexity. The system hides in plain sight, wrapped in technical language, quantitative easing, reserve ratios, bond operations, liquidity facilities, forward guidance. Words that sound like they belong to experts, not citizens. And because people feel unqualified to question it, they don't. They accept inflation as normal, debt as normal, crises as normal, booms and busts as the natural rhythm of a free market economy, rather than the predictable outcome of a machine built on expanding obligations. But once you cut through the complexity, once you remove the jargon, the truth becomes simple. America's currency is created by an institution that is not fully public. That institution creates money as debt. The government must borrow to spend. The public must pay interest through taxation and inflation. Private banks participate in the structure and profit from it. And the cycle must always expand to survive. You start to see that the real conflict in America has never been between left and right, between Democrats and Republicans. It has been between those who control money creation and those who live under it. Every debate you hear, tax cuts, spending bills, deficit reduction, economic growth, exists within a cage built more than a century ago. A cage where the government cannot create its own currency without borrowing, where the public must absorb the costs, and where the institutions closest to the source accumulate power cycle after cycle. And as long as this system remains, no policy can fundamentally alter the hierarchy. No election can rewrite the foundation, because the foundation is the machine itself. A machine that prints money from nothing, a machine that turns creation into obligation, a machine that binds the government to perpetual debt, a machine that converts inflation into silent taxation, a machine that quietly redistributes wealth upward, a machine that controls the rhythm of the economy like a metronome no one can turn off. And the most remarkable part of it all? Most Americans never notice, because the system doesn't need to hide. It only needs to stay complicated enough that people stop asking questions. But once you understand how the machine works, once you see the moving parts, once you recognize the loops of influence, the cycles of debt, the consequences of money creation, everything changes. You begin to see that national debt is not a political problem, it's a structural requirement. You begin to see that inflation is not an accident, it's a feature. You begin to see that economic crises are not random, they are pressure valves in a system built on expansion. You begin to see that the power of the Federal Reserve is not in policymaking, it's in the ability to define what money is. And when you finally grasp that, you reach the real revelation. The true center of power in America is not Congress. It is not the White House. It is not the Supreme Court. It is the system that governs the creation of the dollar, the institutions that write the rules of money itself. Because everything in modern life, your mortgage, your rent, your salary, your savings, your investments, your retirement, flows from the dollar, and the dollar flows from them. Once you understand that money is not just paper, not just numbers, not just value, but obligation, leverage, and control, you start to understand why the system surrounding it feels untouchable. Because it wasn't designed just to function. It was designed to endure. To outlast elections, to outlast crises, to outlast public opinion, and it has. For over a century, through wars, depressions, recessions, booms, bubbles, political battles, global conflicts, and social upheavals, the architecture of money creation has never been fundamentally changed. Policies shift, leaders rotate, narratives evolve, but the foundation remains exactly the same. The government borrows, the Fed creates, the public pays, and the cycle continues. But the most important question is the one people almost never ask. If the system benefits a select few while placing the long-term burden on the many, why does it persist? Why does no president, no Congress, no administration truly challenge it? Because challenging the system would mean redefining what money is. It would mean transferring the core power of the American economy away from the institutions that currently hold it. And those institutions are deeply embedded, not just in finance, but in government, in policy, in global markets, and in the daily functioning of the world's most powerful economy. Pulling them out would be like trying to remove the engine from a jet while it's flying. So instead of changing the machine, every generation simply adapts to it. They learn to live with rising prices. They learn to live with widening inequality. They learn to live with a national debt so large that no one truly expects it to ever be paid off. They learn to live with a system that quietly rewards those who stand closest to the source and silently burdens those who stand farthest from it. But here's the twist. While the public sees inflation, debt ceilings, market crashes, and economic cycles as random events, the institutions inside the system see them as signals, indicators, tools. Because every crisis grants more influence to the entities capable of issuing liquidity, and every recovery reinforces the idea that the system, as complicated as it is, works. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the optimism, beneath the recovery headlines, the structure continues to funnel wealth upward. Every time new money enters the system, it moves first through banks, corporations, and financial markets before it ever reaches ordinary people. By the time it trickles down, purchasing power has already shifted, prices have already risen, and the value of each dollar has already thinned. This is why economists talk about the Cantillon effect, the simple, brutal reality that money benefits those who receive it first. And in a system where money is created through debt, through bonds, through liquidity operations, through financial channels, the people closest to the spigot profit the most. Everyone else works harder for dollars that buy less. It makes you wonder, is this really just an economic structure? Or is it a hierarchy disguised as a system? Because when you examine the movement of money, the flow of influence, and the cycles of wealth, you start to see a pattern that transcends finance. A pattern that looks less like a free market democracy and more like a pyramid, one where the people at the top understand the architecture and the people at the bottom live inside it without ever seeing the frame. But once you do see it, once the blueprint becomes visible, you can never look at the world the same way again. You begin to question why the national debt has never been paid down despite trillions in tax revenue. You begin to question why inflation is considered normal when it erodes every worker's purchasing power. You begin to question why financial institutions receive instant support during crises, while ordinary Americans wait months. You begin to question why the government with the power to tax does not have the power to create its own currency debt-free. You begin to question why every dollar must be borrowed into existence. And eventually, you reach the most important question of all. If the government doesn't control the creation of money, who does? The answer reveals the true hierarchy of power in America. Not the politicians, not the cabinet members, not the lawmakers who argue on television, not the presidents who serve 4 or 8 years before fading into history. The real power lies with the system itself, the machinery built more than a century ago, shaped by private interests, maintained by public authority, and insulated from the democratic cycle. A system where private banks elect directors within the Federal Reserve Network, where those directors help appoint the presidents of the regional Fed banks, where those presidents sit on the committee that sets national monetary policy, where money is created as debt, guaranteed by the government, funded by taxpayers, and funneled upward through interest, dividends, and asset inflation. A system where those who benefit also influence, where those who profit also participate, where those who stand closest to the origin of money stand closest to power. Once you understand this, the viral question that circulates online suddenly makes sense. Why doesn't the Federal Reserve owe the money it creates? Because it creates the money. To owe something it would have to borrow it. The Fed doesn't borrow dollars into existence. It generates them, instantly, without labor, without production, without repayment. But the government, your government, does owe it. And you, through inflation and taxation, support the system without ever touching its controls. That is the secret most people never see. Not because it's hidden, but because it's complicated enough that no one bothers to question it. And because questioning it means confronting a truth that feels bigger than any individual. The people who control the creation of money control the direction of the nation. They control the cost of borrowing. They control the availability of credit. They control the rhythm of markets. They control the value of every dollar in every American pocket. They control the silent tax called inflation. They control the mechanism that keeps the government in perpetual debt. And by extension, they control the structure that governs the lives of over 330 million people, not through elections, not through campaigns, not through speeches or ballots, but through the quiet, mathematical, mechanical authority to define what money is. When you finally understand that, you understand everything.